I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. Now, Mr Speaker, I don't want to sound naive coming to this debating chamber and bemoaning all the politics we're hearing in a parliamentary debating chamber, but we sure are hearing an awful lot of politics. As my colleague Dr Kennedy Graham said, maybe some of it's a bit more heat than light. But Mr Speaker, politics is the problem. This is why we find ourselves in this chamber today. Now, I'm not trying to sound sanctimonious as the Honourable Member Trevor Mallard alleged I was. I'm just trying to reflect a fact, which is it's politics that sees us here today because of the political point scoring, the games, the eventual political deadlock Parliament found itself in. But I also want to say on the flip side that despite the debate, and it's pretty robust, I think it would win some points in some debating clubs around the country, but the fact is that we're working together. Now, there are 6 political parties coming together tonight to listen to the people, to include their choice, and I think that's fantastic. Because on one hand, you can see all the political rhetoric, hear all the debate, and on the other side, we're actually seeing some practical, tangible benefits of working together, and I believe this is what the public decided in one of those seminal referenda in our history, which is when we decided to move to MMP. So I'd like to acknowledge the debate, acknowledge the opinions, and most of all acknowledge political parties working together. Now, Mr Speaker, why we sought leave to table this bill today and introduce it was because we wanted to break that political deadlock. We're not trying to play games, we're not trying to score points, we're not trying to get one over anyone. We don't care whose name's on the bill, what happens. What we cared about was offering a constructive, pragmatic, practical solution which could get the votes in this House. And as you saw in the first reading vote, it was an overwhelming majority support listening to the people and support a 5th flag being included in the referenda. In this contribution, I'd like to touch on some of the criticism and respond to some of the debate. I'd like to reiterate some of the Green Party's position points and also issue some thanks. So let's start off with some of the debate we've heard tonight. I'd like to acknowledge Trevor Mallard in particular for some of the things he said. Now, he raised a question which I think needs to be addressed. Now, Mr Mallard said because in the legislation Red Peak wasn't explicitly mentioned in the clauses of the legislation, somehow we were going to get some odd option. Maybe laser kiwi, which I think maybe was the second most popular choice amongst New Zealanders. Now, it staggers me to think that Mr Mallard's been in Parliament almost as old as I am, I believe, sir, that, and no doubt seen his own bills pass through Parliament, become acts and his work in the ministries. Now, it's quite a precedent in New Zealand for this Parliament, as part of our relationship with the Governor-General, as part of our Crown relationship, the Executive to the Governor-General, Parliament can't instruct the Governor-General to do anything. That's our constitutional framework, and actually, despite being a card-carrying Republican, it would be obscene, I believe, for this Parliament under our current conventions to be ordering the Governor-General what to do. But that's why the protections are in there in the explanatory statement, obviously the debates and the Hansard in this House. So before this turns into some myth, if this was some sort of myth or otherwise which Labour's trying to share, the fact is that this bill is about Red Peak and this bill only implements that. Now, from New Zealand First, we heard allegations of Nazi symbolism in Red Peak. Now, I'd like to address that because what they're referring to is some of the pillboxes that was used in Germany, which used alternating coloured lines. Now, I think this is outrageous. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's scurrilous. And I think it's despicable that they should be drawing this sort of link, particularly when we know the horrors that occurred under that regime. Now, I'd like to address the issue of why we're here in urgency. Now, I talked about politics, the reason we're here. Politics was the problem, and I'm sure more political games is definitely not the answer. We're here under urgency, and I acknowledge it's not ideal. We're here under urgency because the clock is ticking, because we're less than 6 weeks away from the referendum. No doubt, surely the Electoral Commission is about to be printing millions of pieces of paper so that Kiwis can have their democratic say. There was a literal, urgent means for Parliament to move in haste. Now, for more than a week, The country has watched the two parties if they've talked, they've traded letters, traded allegations and spin through the media. For more than a week, we've sat here and waited. There's real urgency, the clock was ticking, it was time for someone to act. Ideally, of course, this wouldn't have happened under urgency. I believe in an ideal world, the Cabinet, through an order in Council, could have simply listened to the public and included a fifth option, which was Red Peak. Why we put the bill to Parliament today was because the time was running out, but also to test the Prime Minister's proposition. Now, the Prime Minister made a challenge to parties in New Zealand and said that if there could be political support amongst the parties, excluding New Zealand First, whose position was clearly known, the National Party would support it. Now, that proposition's been tested and it's been found true, and I'd like to thank and welcome the support of all the political parties in the government adopting my bill. Now, fourthly and lastly, the issue of the yes-no vote. Now, I believe there are legitimate and logical arguments on both sides. I believe both sides can make a case. I understand it. I'm sympathetic to the Labour Party's position. I believe a lot of New Zealanders behind them. But I'd like to point out that our position in choosing this bill isn't to relitigate the entire process. Our position isn't trying to score any points over anyone. Our position is simply trying to listen to the will of the people to make sure we get that fifth option before that clock counts down and it's too late. So I'd like to reiterate some of the positions, which is the reason we're doing this is because there was a phenomenal groundswell of support. It wasn't the case of any other bill in this process. We saw 50,000 people in the space of only a week support this bill. We only saw, I believe, around 7,000 people engage with the official consultation process. We saw a massive, overwhelming groundswell of support in only a single week, I'd remind the House. That's why we're trying to make sure those people's voices are heard. Secondly, I don't believe this is the most important thing that should be taking up Parliament's time. Maybe Dennis O'Rourke and I agree on that. When it comes to $26 million of taxpayers' money, I'd rather that money was spent on feeding kids school lunches. If we're talking about $26 million, I'd rather that was installing solar panels on every school in this country so the kids could save money and spend it on musical instruments and sports equipment rather than rising power bills. There's a host of things we could do with this money, and I believe it's a legitimate and a right question to ask, is this the right time to be changing it? Are we actually having that genuine public conversation around what does the flag represent? Who are we as a people and where are we going as a nation in 2015? Should we also be looking at some of our constitutional arrangements? Now, Mr. Speaker, despite being a card-carrying Republican, I believe that the most important constitutional question we should be asking ourselves is how do we enshrine Te Tiriti o Waitangi in our constitutional frameworks? So it's not the most important thing. It was an incredibly flawed process, but the fact is it was happening. We voted against the government's bill, but it passed. It became an act. The referendum was going to happen in less than 6 weeks' time. And if it was going to continue down the track with a political deadlock and parties trading letters and sitting in their respective offices, nothing was going to change. It wasn't going to be improved. Those tens of thousands of Kiwis who wanted a fifth option wouldn't have got listened to. So this was simply about improving the legislation. I'd like to thank a number of people. I'd like to thank the big team actually behind the drafting of the legislation. I'd like to acknowledge our spokesperson, Dr. Kennedy Graham, who I know has been acknowledged in this debate as playing with a straight bat throughout the select committee process and the other parts of this process. I'd like to thank the other parties for their support. I know from the national members some of the kind words to the Greens have been genuine, which we thank. Some of it has been damning with faint praise, which of course we reject, but it's good that we can work together on this as we worked with home insulation, the National Cycleway, just as we worked with Labour with some pioneering climate policies in the last Labour government. In summary, I don't know if this is going to be the flag we're going to get. I don't even know if the flag's going to change. It doesn't matter. Regardless what your opinion is, Silver Fern, Red Peak, keep the flag, whatever, we at least have a choice. And I believe it will genuinely up to Kiwis and they'll express their will in the two referenda. But I think most importantly is maybe a young member, I really want to reflect on this, that many of the supporters of the Red Peak were younger Kiwis. And if they had just been disregarded by this House, if they'd been ignored, if politics got in the way of that choice, I fear we would have disillusioned a whole new cohort, tens of thousands of New Zealanders who literally wanted a choice. So I'm glad that we can work together. I'm glad that we can put politics aside for a wee bit. And Mr Speaker, I look forward to the progress of this bill.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.